Hello, I'm Steph from My Driver Classic, and today we are taking a step back in time once more to have a look at another rather fine pre-war motor. And today we're looking at the Riley 1.5. This is a 1937 model registered in September 1936. Although you may know it as the Riley 12.4, but this is the thing with Riley, things become very convoluted in that pre-Nuffield era. But we're going to go into all the details of that today. Now, this was once a car that was seen on various streets across Britain and really was one of the most beautiful cars that came out of the 1930s. So in today's video, because you may never have seen one before, we're going to get up close and personal, go for a walk around, look under the bonnet, have a look at the inside, see what a car that's nearly 100 years old has fared like after all these decades, and then we're going to end up with a drive. And this is quite an interesting drive today because we have the Wilson pre-selector box in this, and if you've never seen one of those before, it's definitely worth watching for that alone. So come on then, let's go for a walk round, we'll have a look at this Riley and I'll tell you all about it. You might be wondering who would drive such a fine vehicle in 2024, and it might surprise some of you that this lovely 1.5 is owned by a young lady named Alex, who is aged under 25 and has been inspired by her granddad's love of pre-war motors and classic cars to invest in a Riley herself. Although this certainly isn't Alex's first classic, because I've known her for many years, and she even had a Morris Minor at 17, which she's bought back and is slowly doing up alongside this Riley. And it's wonderfully refreshing to take a car on test today, which isn't winding down at the end of many decades, but is now being revived and nurtured by someone who is a relative beginning of their motoring life. Now, coming back to the car, these 1.5 litre Rileys were very popular, but it's sometimes known as the 12.4, which is named as such because of the 12 horsepower rating. And no, it doesn't mean that the engine is 12 horsepower, but relates to the RAC taxation classes of the era. Again, it's why you see cars badge things like the Austin 10 or the Morris 10, and it's all related to that taxation class. And I believe for each additional horsepower, so say jumping up from 10 to 11, you'd incur an additional £1 extra tax. Might not seem a lot today, but trust me, back then it was a deal breaker. In fact, we recently touched on this in the pre-war Ford video, so you can go back and watch that if you want to know a little bit more. After the Riley 9, the 12.4 or the 1.5 litre, as we're testing here today, was one of the most popular of the pre-war Rileys. The Riley range can sometimes feel convoluted when you start looking at it, and the 12.4 naming convention was done away with in 1934, and they then rebadged the cars as the 1.5 litre, so they come in late 34. And they still used the same familiar trio of body options that had been used on the 12.4. And so with that, you get the Falcon, the Kestrel and the Lynx. And if you're wondering why they switch it up from the 12.4 to the 1.5 litre after the 1934 revision, it's because they felt that the 12.4 naming convention was too close to the 12.6 naming convention, which was another family of cars that they had. And they wanted the vehicles under the 12.6 umbrella to have a clear market distinction to that buyer. The range is then again completely overhauled once more in 1936, although it is still known as the 1.5 litre cars. But it is where you start to see a little bit more distinction come in between the various bodies. So you get the Lynx and the Falcon bodies, they change slightly, but for the Kestrel, as we're testing here today, that moves on somewhat because then you get the introduction of the 6 light body. I talked earlier about the popularity of the 12.4 and later 1.5 cars, and Riley really capitalised on that. They decided that the buyer needed even more choice, at which point they introduced 3 new models, and they're known as the Merlin, the Adelphi and the Sprite. It's worth noting that the Sprite is the top of the range, it's the most sporty, and they do offer various elements of that Sprite car as a top specification across all the other models. Now, this can start feeling awfully confusing on paper. So when I was explaining it to someone who doesn't really know about cars, the best way to think about it is this. So the 1.5 is the engine, and therefore that's the family name, the family tree. And if you consider that as the main trunk, all these cars coming off it, the Merlin, the Adelphi, the Falcon, the Kestrel, all of those are essentially branches. Now, there are many nuances, changes and upgrades pre-war, including a body change for the Falcon, a Continental touring saloon, which then has a very short time span in the range, which ends up making everything rather complicated when you're retelling the story or, with a more commercial head on, trying to sell it into a buying public. And you'll know from many different brands and stories that too much choice is never a good thing. But we're going to come back to that later because that relates to something else. So coming back to the engine, Riley was shrewd in their development. And when they were designing this, they ensured that it was a touch under 1500cc. Now you might be asking the reason behind that. Well, that's because then they can enter it into certain rallying classes and races. Realistically, I could do a full hour-long video on the triumphs of Riley. But in short, Riley were known for their prowess, and a lot of this is down to the keen engine development and the design of the cars. And in fact, the engine was first conceived in the early 1930s, and it was coming in to fill a gap. It was between the 9 and the 14.6. Percy Riley, who was one of the Riley brothers, was adamant that the soon-to-launch 12.6 that he was really working on would do the trick. But his brothers said, look, let's rethink this. And with that, they developed a new 4-cylinder block. This new block closely mirrored Percy's 9 engine, but was enlarged and refined to achieve greater power. Interestingly, it was also designed in a way that it could have been dialed down to achieve a 10 horsepower engine to replace the 9, but this just never happened. It's then rolled out with those 1934 cars that I was talking about previously, and it's then tweaked for the 1936 cars. And to give them their due, Riley didn't sit around. And if you look at their range, if you look at their improvements that they make, they really strived for endless improvement, endless refinement, and had a hunger for getting things spot on that many manufacturers could learn a thing or two from today. Now, there was a man, or certainly a team, that recognised the potential for Riley. And with that, Nuffield comes in and buys the company in 1938 and does a takeover. And what do? Well, we come back to that too much choice thing. They say, right, there is too much choice, too much to confuse buyers. And they immediately streamline the range and make it more succinct. Now, I do think if the Second World War hadn't happened, things might have been slightly different. But all in all, Nuffield doesn't capitalise on the Riley name and quality in a way that it really should have. And instead, they just seem to let the brand die out. And I think the last use of the Riley name is on those ADO 16 cars. And sometimes Riley diehards say to you, oh, it's not a real Riley. But what they mean is they mean it's not part of the original Riley family. However, despite the Nuffield takeover and the quashing of the endless variants, they did keep the engine going, and it powered the RMA E cars after the war, which are just beautiful in their own right. And in fact, the use of the engine continued until 1955, over 20 years since it was first conceived on the workbench by the team at Riley. Today, the name Riley isn't remembered in the same way that it maybe was 50 years ago, but it certainly doesn't mean it's forgotten. There's a friendly owners club or two and plenty of people to ask for advice should one of these cars take your fancy after watching the video today. Coming inside here, it's hard to believe that this is standard, because there is so much going on, as I'm going to show you. But in terms of your levels of trim and in terms of what it offered, you had 3. You had standard, you then had special, and you then had sprite. And there's a few features on this that are on those specials and sprites cars, but we'll come back to that in just a second, because we have got an awful lot going on in here. And first of all, you've got your glove box over on the left-hand side, which is mirrored on the right-hand side. You might be wondering why they've done that, and we've talked a lot about things like this on some of these older cars. Is what they used to do is they used to think about the continental market and selling overseas, because when Britain was part of the empire, a lot of cars went abroad, and especially after the Second World War, you see that export or die, and you see a lot more of this mirroring. But the idea is that you can change it over from right-hand drive to left-hand drive with minimal additional costs. Coming into the centre here, you'll notice that the dash has got quite a lot going on for a 30s car. I thought we were spoilt when we went out in some of those other special cars, things like the Standard, the Jowett. But coming inside here, this Riley really takes the biscuit. Now, running over from left to right, we've got the thermostat, and then you've got the petrol and oil gauge. You might be wondering how that works. Now, you see here, it runs from 0 to full, just like you would expect on a normal petrol gauge. Now that's running on petrol as standard. If you want to see how much oil you've got in, you simply press this button just here. I would love to demo this for you, but Here's the thing, as I was telling you when we were walking around, Alex is a young woman and she's bought this car as a work in progress. And she said, Steph, I'm so sorry, there's a couple of bits that aren't quite there. I said, Alex, you've only had the car for a few weeks. Don't worry about it. So sadly, I think it's the temperature gauge and this petrol and oil gauge which aren't currently working. But isn't it just marvellous to see such a young lady take on a car of this calibre, to be going at it with full gusto, to be improving it? For me, it makes that immaterial. Now coming down from there, you've got your panel lights on the dash. Now it's quite, for this grey year that we're having so far, bright. Now if you can see there, that light coming on, it's relatively bright for one of these older cars, which makes it rather marvellous. Now over here, you've got this pull, which is your wipers. And one of the things that I want to talk about, without getting too misty-eyed, is there's so many bits on this car that hark back to all the British engineering firms that used to feed into these cars. So up here you've got British Berkshire feeding in for the wiper motor. You've got a little plaque up here from a company in London, even right down to the seat adjustable, all marked out for just all these little tiny firms that used to feed in to these giant automotive companies that went out then across the world. And you think today, everything is just blank. It just feeds into a giant machine and you don't know who all the little companies are that feed in and create these end products. So this is one of the details that I really like on this. But anyway, coming back into the centre here, you can see you've got the clock and you've got your speedo running up to 100 miles per hour. Now, I think there's a bit of a misconception that a lot of pre-war cars won't do great speeds. You see people talking about, oh, I would never buy one because they don't go above 40 miles per hour. Cars like this, and bear in mind we are in the standard variant, if you go up for a Sprite, you can be doing up to 100 miles per hour because, as we were talking about earlier, Riley were out there winning competitions, racing these cars. These engines were designed to be winning races. They weren't designed to be sitting in the slow lane. So even this at standard, we can be looking at, without thrashing it, 70 to 75 miles per hour. So I jokingly said to Alex, would you take it on the motorway then? And she said, yeah. No problems at all. 60, 65, she's sitting out on the motorway without any cares in the world, which for me makes this car incredibly usable and also very comfortable. Now coming over from here, you've got your ammeter and you've also got your oil pressure gauge, which means that you've really got an eye on everything that's going on and feeding into the car. And it's got more going on with this than I have in a Morris Minor from 1968. It's unbelievable sometimes when you look at the cost cutting that companies did when they stepped back and started taking stuff away. Now you might be wondering what these two do. Well, nice and simple. So you've got your choke over on the left hand side and you've got your push start just here. And that is all our controls and various bits and pieces on the dash. And coming around us, this is where things start to get a little bit more interesting and perhaps out your usual realm of knowledge for older cars. So first of all, you've got your retard and advance on this. So when you start the car, because I'm never very good with this, I said to Alex, I said, where would we start if we were starting on a cold morning? And she said, you'd start down here in retard and then you would gently bring it up into advance. And she did advise me, actually, because she's got quite a lot of experience in pre-war motors, that you don't really need to be using too much choke. So you'll see, because we've already been out for a drive today, whilst we've been learning to drive the vehicle, then we're not going to need to use that too much. Coming up here, you've got your indicators. Again, just so lovely to see all these original switches and in such fine condition as well. Now that is, of course, operating trafficators. It's not like the indicators that you would have in a modern car, but Alex hasn't changed that. That's still as it was. Coming down from there, you've got your light switch. So at the moment it's in the off position, but you've got side, dip and head. And then you've got the horn push. Now this is working, so I'm going to demo it for you. That's not too bad. And then over on the right hand side, you're probably looking at this and saying, Steph, what on earth is that? Well, if you watch the Armstrong Siddeley video, it may seem rather familiar because it is the pre-selector box. Now, I'm going to get into a little bit of geeky knowledge. I believe it was 1934 that Riley stopped making their own gearboxes. And at which point they say, right, we're going to look at what else is out there. And they loved the Wilson pre-selector box that was being made and used by Armstrong Siddeley. So they then put this into these cars. But it feels like it's quite a short period in time because, of course, as we were talking about, Nuffield takes over the company in, I think, 38, 39. And it's in 38 that they then introduce the Borg-Warner box, which I think it's a manual with it's got the overdrive on the top two gears. It's so hard to remember, like all these changes that go on throughout the 30s. And if you're wondering, by the way, what came before the Wilson pre-selector, it was the fully crashed box. So you see it if you look at some of the older cars, but anyway, that's by the by. Now, I am going to say one thing, is that when we start a car, usually we rev it and it's all completely fine. But Alex was saying that you can't really rev these cars with these Wilson pre-selector boxes. That's fine. We're not going to rev it today, but I wanted you to hear the engine just burbling because it just is such a beautiful note. So what I'm going to do, we'll get the key and we'll get it started up and you can have a listen. Now, when we go out, and you might have noticed under the bonnet actually that you've got the twin carbs on this. Now, the twin carb feature isn't actually fitted to the standards. It was fitted to the Sprite and the Special, I believe. On this, it would have just had the Zenith single carb. So just worth mentioning, it's just something that's been done. But Alex was telling me, because I said, do you think that's been put on after purchase? And she said quite often people could go in and twist Riley's arm and have these little odds and sods popped on at the time. So it could have been just something that was put on. And I know that some of you like some of the finer details, so it is worth mentioning as well that it's believed that this is the original engine. And that's because what they used to do was when they used to bring them out of the production line at Riley, you'd have the engine number and the chassis number, and they'd be kind of roughly the same. But Alex was telling me that what they've realised from records that were released from Riley that you can examine now at places like the British Motor Museum is quite often they're one or two numbers out, and I believe the engine on this is one number out from the chassis, but I'm sure that it's the original, because why would it just be one extra? The only thing I will say is it has got the bigger valve head on this, which was fitted to the Special and the Sprite. So probably a little bit nippier than standard. But I'm going to start her up, have a little listen and see what you think. Should we have a little listen from the outside as well? Right, let's go on an adventure. First of all, we need to select our gear with this pre-selector box, which means I move up into that first unit there, and then to get into gear, what I'm going to do is put my foot down on the clutch and then remove it again, and that selects the gear. Now we have to do it with some gusto. Let me show you. There we go. If you don't get it right, you end up with a false neutral. But here's the thing, it's so simple. I've selected second, I'm back down, and there we go. And third, and we've got fourth pre-selected, so let's do it. And there we go. Now I want to show you something really bizarre. There's a little bit of the pre-selector box that slightly sticks out. And at first I found it quite hard to change gear because I kept knocking the side of my ankle. But again, once you get used to these little foibles, you can get into the driving experience very, very quickly. And in fact, I would say that this is probably the easiest pre-war car that I've ever driven. I'm finding it so easy to cope with. Now I know that I need to go to third as I come round, but I'd already selected that third gear just to help with the engine braking. Now, if you're wondering what the brakes are on this, it's the Girling rod brakes on this. And they've obviously been adjusted quite well because they do stop the car quite keenly. Now we're picking up speed again, so we've selected 4th. And look how easy it is. This is only my 2nd attempt at driving this. And my goodness, what a car it is to drive. It is so easy. And so many people think that these pre-war cars are hard to get into, they're difficult to drive, and they become so put off by the whole experience. Not so. You need to jump in one of these. It is just one of the easiest and most straightforward cars to get into. And in fact, I would say something like this is far easier to drive than some stuff that comes 10, even 20 years after this. It's just a real joy. Now, you can probably see the steering is remarkably spot on, and in terms of the heaviness of it, it's really no more heavy than you'd expect. It's not ungainly when you're trying to come around corners or you're trying to do a turn in the road. It's very, very simple indeed. Now, the seating position in this, you'll probably notice the seats have been retrimmed. Alex has done a little bit of jiggery-pokery and done a little bit of adjusting on the driver's seat to bring it slightly down, because she said she was so high up in the seat that it just didn't feel quite right. I'm going to drop down again into 3rd there as we come around this sharp corner. See how easy it is. But anyway, even though Alex has slightly adjusted this seat, you can still see to the end of the bonnet. It is just so easy. We've got one mirror just here, which gives us all the visibility we need, and I'm just blown away by how modern it feels. I fully expected to get in it for it to feel really antiquated, for it to feel quite cumbersome, and instead I come into a car which feels smart, responsive, so modern and forward thinking, and I love it. I absolutely love it. When I started today, I said to Alex, what drew you to a Riley? And she said, my family have always had Rileys. You know, my granddad has had countless examples, which meant that for her, jumping into something like this didn't feel intimidating. For me, it felt quite intimidating, but now that I've been in this one and that I've driven it, I totally get the magic. I see why Alex and her granddad are so enamoured with the brand. And it's one of those things, isn't it, that it's a brand which nowadays, for many, doesn't have many tangible memories, because a lot of people won't have seen these out on the roads, and so sometimes that natural allure isn't there. But trust me, they are well worth their weight in gold. It's such an easy little thing to drive, and I guess all we've got to say is more people need to get behind the wheel and have a bit of a go with them. Now, as you can see, I was able to select neutral before we'd even come to a stop. I do think I need to get into that clutch a little more. Can you see there just how easy that is? Now, there we go, we come into 2nd. Oh, there's a lot going on here. And we go up into the 3rd there, and you can just see how easy this is, but also just how fast the vehicle is and how easy it is to keep up with modern traffic. It really is, for me, that pre-war car that does it all. It's an attractive shape, that rakish design, it's speedy enough to be keeping up with modern traffic, and it's so easy to drive that I would say someone who's never really driven a classic before would find this incredibly easy to get along with. So those are my words for today: easy, gentle, modern, forward thinking. Apart from me keep bashing my ankle, there really isn't anything that I can do it down for. I can totally see why Alex has taken this on as a do-upper, and I'm so excited for her. And I guess all we need to do now is just take a few more of these cars, get them into the hands of young people, and keep that love of Riley alive, because I'll tell you what, it's certainly a car that deserves it. Now, I really hope you've enjoyed this video today. If you're new to the channel, there are plenty more pre-war cars in the back catalogue to be watching, and if you have a pre-war car yourself that you'd like to see on the channel, please do get in touch at idriveaclassic@gmail.com. That email is in the description box below. But from me, until next time, take care and drive safely.